Today we have with us Rupesh Sudhanshu, an artist currently based in London. His practice mainly consists of painting, with colourful subject matter veering towards the uncanny. Welcome to Listening to the Shades. We're so glad to have you with us. Can you talk a little bit about the thematic focus of your work?
Sure, yeah. I think from last 1 year or so, my practice has kind of moved towards more towards uh, understanding the whole concept of universal consciousness, which is Brahman in our Hinduism philosophy. So that's primarily what I'm focusing on, but how I'm kind of representing that is through subjects such as animals, humans, but I'm using that as a way to like comment on the socio-political uh, climate of the present. So basically, what I do is like I deal with a lot of like issues around identity politics, how was the relationship we share with different cultures, our environment, and especially around how animals have been used in contemporary art
Yeah.
and what's their identity like. So yeah, that's gist of my practice.
Can you talk more about the idea of a universal conscious? Like, what, how does your exploration of that like combine with current socio-political issues?
Uh, Quite interesting actually. So this has started, the whole journey started 2 years back when I was back in my hometown. I'm from Ranchi actually. So there's a tribal art form in Ranchi known as Sohrai. And I ended up doing a field research on that. And so I particularly went to a couple of villages over there known as, the area is known as Hagaribagh.
Yeah.
So there is a couple of villages where I went there and I saw like these amazing wall art, so like graffiti work done by women artisans over there. And that kind of like got me very intrigued about learning more about it. And I was sort of like very curious about what's the impetus behind them doing these kind of work. So I ended up talking to these artisans. I interviewed them for like say like it was a 3 month long research I did, and in that process I understood like I started to like learn about how that particular art form is more of a tribal sort of like practice,
Yeah.
and it has been practiced from the Mesolithic era,
Yeah.
and they have still continued that.
Yeah.
So in that conversation, what I also realized that for them, whatever they are doing, the form of creativity that they have is not it's not a mean of say to put something out there, but it's more like to just make a mark. And then that led me to like George Batel's idea about how cave art has like redefined human beings. So he kind of made a statement in his book, The Birth of Art, where he said that the very act of human being putting these gestures on say like cave wall was humans transition from being an animal to being a human being. And I'm very fascinated by that idea of how mark making is something is very primitive.
Yeah.
So I picked that up from there, and I wanted to like explore further into it, and that kind of led me to this exploration into the sublime nature of our being. So there are many artists, and like if you look at the Enlightenment period, this sublime was a major theme which was
Yeah.
explored by artists like J.M.W. Turner or like Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich. So they explored these themes of sublime. And when I was doing this, I realized that in our own culture in Hinduism, we have defined this sublime by Brahman. So basically, the core idea of sublime is that something that you can't comprehend, something
Yeah.
that you don't understand, yet it gives you a feeling of awe and inspiration.
Yeah.
And when you read the Hindu idealism system, you realize that we have defined this sublime nature through Brahman and Atman. These are the two concepts that comes from there. And yeah, that sort of like led me to this path. And yeah, and since I come from a Hindu family where my upbringing has been very religious, where I'm taught that all animals or like all the surrounding is part of this Brahman, which is supposed to be revered and like prayed to.
Yeah.
And I think that has been ingrained in me since childhood. So I just wanted to explore that kind of into my own expression that, okay, if I'm taught this thing, how would it look when I try to represent that in my paintings? So yeah, that was the core inspiration there.
That sounds really beautiful. So, like Sohrai and Kova artists, so like the women that paint there, they're not necessarily Brahmin or they're not religious, but they
Yeah,
also
yeah,
like there's a lot of animal imagery that they involve in their
yeah,
work too. So like the Pashupati is a big one, I think.
yeah.
So, how did did their exploration of animals also kind of bleed into your work and the way that you think about animals? Because I've seen that in a lot of your images you depict objects like in a really surrealistic way, this like in the same vein as like Sohrai cover art, even if it's
Yeah, yeah,
quite different, and like you have animals in like unconventional and warped ways, so like monkeys I think is
yeah,
a big one.
yeah, yeah. Uh, See, when I was doing this research, what I realized was, even though these women are not coming from the same background or same culture,
Yeah.
the core idea was still the same. They for them, the whole tapestry of these flora and fauna is what they see as very religious.
Yeah.
So for them, when they are depicting these animals, that means that they are like sort of it's a way to like say that you see a deity or a god in the
Yeah.
flora and fauna. So that's why they are choosing these subjects, and this sort of like correlates to my own like upbringing as well, where in Hinduism it is taught that, say for example, cow or our mother, right? So basically, it's the same idea that these women were following, and I kind of like saw really interesting like similarity in both, even though they are miles apart. And yeah, I think that's sort of like I found that quite interesting actually because even though these women are not Brahmin, they are not taught the religious idioms that we have been taught, but the core essence is still the same. That the environment is our bread and butter, and it is supposed to be seen as something religious or something symbolic. And yeah, that was the whole. That just seemed very interesting to me, honestly.
That makes a lot of sense. I've also noticed that, like, actually, two questions. The first one is like, you also have like this recurring motif of like legs in your work.
Yeah,
So, can you talk a
yeah.
little bit about that?
That's something I've recently started to explore. So so during my entire masters, I was more focused around understanding or sort of like challenging the notion of animal representation in contemporary art. So, so if you look at the history, like I'm going to talk a bit about what I did, so that it makes sense with
Go
what I'm
ahead.
doing now.
Yeah.
So, in my masters, my entire research paper was focused around understanding the representation of art throughout history, and then finding a way to like suggest or say what's happening now. So when I was doing my research, what I realized that uh, so basically there are three facets to it. One was understanding what modernism was and what were the philosophies around modernism and what kind of representation was being done. And then I moved towards postmodernism, where like you have artists like Andy Warhol, Barbara Kruger, Frank Gehry. So they were like challenging the notion of modernism to like suggest arrival of a new contemporary discourse.
Yeah.
So while I was doing my research, what I realized was animals were subject to like there was a huge exploitation of animals in contemporary representation, where animals were used as an idea or reflection of human emotions for so like there are lot of artists
Like Hearst.
for example like Damien like for example the Damien Hirst physical impossibility where he like put a shark as a in his gallery space, and you have artists like Jeff Koons, Maurizio Catalan, who like so Maurizio Catalan is quite interesting actually. By the way, he was the one who did the banana piece, which got very controversial.
I actually
So
like the banana
Maurizio,
piece, but yeah, continue.
yeah, it's a concept, but it's also debatable. But so, but yeah, like my focus was understanding around like how animals were exploited. So Maurizio Catalan, what he was doing was he put a dead horse and a dead squirrel in the gallery space. So again, my issue with that was, see, on one side, my religion is telling me that God, like animals are supposed to be revered, they are supposed to be prayed, they are sort of like an embodiment of Brahman.
Yeah.
And then I see in the contemporary discourse that animals were used as a symbol of human being, as to represent human emotions, right?
Yeah.
So when I was doing all this discourse, what I realized was there was this new strategy that was coming up. I'm not sure if you're aware, but at this moment, there's a new contemporary discourse ongoing known as metamodernism, or it's also known as performatism.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, what these theoretical vanguards are suggesting that postmodernism is over. People are saturated. People are like tired of oversaturation of definitions and ideas, and so they are suggesting an oscillation between modernism and postmodernism philosophy. So when I came across this idea, I kind of found it very interesting because I wanted to use animals as my subject, but I didn't want to use animal identity and reflect my own identity. Rather, what I wanted to do was I wanted to capture the true essence of what who these animals are, and at the same time also comment on what's going around in the modern world right now. So if you see a lot of my work I was doing previously in the last year, actually, I was talking about themes such as animal abuse, of the whole idea of circus of animals, where you'll see like the monkey painting I did, which was around like representing that the monkey is being tied. So if you know, like in India, there are still practices where you have these Madani traditions where they would come to your houses and they would play the drum and the monkey would dance and you pay them, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's like you are, and that conflict is, so for example, like, so in my religion, he was telling me that we have Lord Hanuman, which is a monkey, who is supposed to be revered as a god.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, I'm seeing these monkey being treated like they are pet, like they are someone to be exploited by human being. So that's that. Yeah. So that kind of conflicted with my whole idea of how I grew up with, and then seeing that, so that became the impetus behind what I did in my masters, where I wanted to comment on this paradoxical nature of devotion and the way the reality works.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work kind of focused on understanding animal identity and how that is not taken into account in contemporary art discourse. So because of that, when I did that, I realized that this was whole Aristotelian view that humans are the center of the universe and they are given the superiority, whereas everything else, like animals, environment, plants, whatever, they are always regarded as something lesser than human beings. So now what I'm doing is I'm trying to challenge that notion. So what you see these elongated leg forms is, in a way, it's a very I feel like it's a satirical take on figurative art in general, or say like I wanted to like create a form to like comment on how we have invaded environment, and the impetus is legs for me. It's like you walk on earth with all your ego and uh, thinking that you are superior and you could treat all the other beings as inferior and justify all the wrongdoings to them. And yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to attempt over here. So the form is what I'm still exploring, and I'm not very sure where it's gonna go. But it's just something that just came to me, to be very honest. And a lot of my work comes that way. I feel like. So whenever someone asks me like, how do I get inspired to paint something? Of course, there are events that's happening around me that's a major influence. But a lot of the time, I do feel like there's this vision of sort, or like something of a guide, which tells me, or like it just appears and I have to put it out there. But yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question. But yeah, that's
No, definitely. Also, I think like the way you talked about kind of negotiating between the way we think about animals in religious circles and like how we are taught to think about animals but how we treat them. I think your like form also talks about how it's a leg with no brains or like no head attached. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like it's existing in the space between being an animal and being a human.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, that's really interesting. You talked about your process and how, these ideas just come to you. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, do you plan out your paintings and your pieces, or do you improvise as you work on them? And, like, how long do they take you? Is it like, a process for months, or are you a quick painter, whatever?
Sure, yeah. I think the best way I could answer this is I'm reminded of this. Uh, so if you know Igor Stravinsky, he was a really great composer. He wrote this piece called La Sacra do Pranto, which is the rite of the passage, where so someone asked him that how did you write this ballet piece, and he said that he did not write that; it wrote itself through him. And I kind of feel very same about my own practice. So there are times where I would wake up in the night with a vision in my head, or like something would appear in my dream, and I have to put it out there, and that becomes the initial impetus. So I would see something in my dream state, and I would feel like, okay, that's interesting. So what I do is afterwards I start to do a lot of research, and I feel like research is integral to my practice. So whatever subject or whatever theme I want to take up on, I before even going to my canvas, I go to my studio, I do research, I read around it, I see what all representation has been done already, and I try to take inspiration from few, and then I move to the canvas and when I start my work, another interesting process is I would do something. I would create, say, for example, I would create certain marks, and the moment I start to feel like, oh, this is looking great, I kind of like start to destroy it because I feel like I don't want that immediate satisfaction out of my work. I want to challenge myself. So every piece I try to do, I try to like purposely destroy it, if that makes sense. Because when I do that, it just shatters all the expectation I have from myself. And after that comes the challenging bit that okay, what do you want to do now? Because what you were expecting to come out is not there. So that's just my way to like push the boundaries of myself in a way to like see how far I could take things, and eventually something happens, and then yeah, I think something good comes out of it in the way. So it's never. So I never start with an image in my head like, okay, this is what the painting is going to be, because I feel like if I do that, I'm going to restrict my representation. So what I do instead is I start the piece, and in the process of working on the canvas, it tells me what it's going to be, and I always every time I sit in front of my canvas, I keep asking the canvas itself that okay, what do you want to be? What do you want to be? And more often than not, I get the answers back, and I just play by instinct, and something just comes out of it. So yeah, that's the process there.
That's really beautiful. Um, you said that it's very instinctive for you, but then you also mentioned that there are socio-political ideas that draw you, and you do a lot of research. So can you like tell me how you navigate between both of those things? So you can't have PhD to either.
So it's like I said, like every time I'm working on the canvas, I'm asking myself and the canvas these questions that what this canvas is supposed to be, and in those moments, it's like you get glimpses of things you have read, things you have experienced. For example, say like if this week I was reading about the whole Ukraine war and the funding to the Ukraine war. And I don't know what I'm going to do about it, right? I'm not sure about it if I'm going to make something out of it. But the moment I'm working on a canvas, things comes in my head, which would be things like I have read, I have experienced, I have been thinking about, and if it comes in my head, I'm going to implement that into the work. So that's how it kind of like starts to manifest. The struggle is how do you create a body of work which kind of says the same theme. So what I try to do is like, for example, if I've created one piece, I take inspiration from that piece, and I try to kind of like find some similarity of that into the next piece that I work on. And at the same time, how do I make the second piece stand on its own? And there comes again the same process where things that I might have experienced, I start to incorporate that into the second piece, and at the same time trying to uh, group that or like sort of like find some similarity with with the previous piece that I have done. So, yeah.
Like even if your works are like thematically broad, I think that there are some like motifs and colors that you come back to. So there's this really bright red that is going to be peppered throughout your pieces. Does that color, for example, hold like an emotional or symbolic significance in your work, or is it just naturally?
I mean, no, of course there's a reason. I'm very inspired by Franz Marc's work, where like his main theme was again animals as well, and he specifically chose certain colors because of the power of those colors to evoke certain emotion. For example, red is seen as very bold, very evocative, whereas blue is for him blue was very masculine, and yellow would be a bit feminine, and so I kind of try to follow that as well, but at the same time, my choice of color also comes from what I've seen growing up, to be honest. And India is a colorful place, right? And there are so many colors all around. And I got inspired by this idea of like how do you incorporate colors which speaks of your culture by looking at Howard Hawkins' work, where he visited India a couple of times and he did a lot of research around the colors of India. So my choice is like, I think it's primarily inspired by two things. One would be my culture, my own cultural association with colors, as well as the very strength colors hold to evoke certain emotion. So in certain works where I feel a bit violent, I would use a lot more red. Whereas in certain pieces where I want to invoke certain calmness, certain spiritual angle, I would tend to move towards say blue tone. But yeah, I think that's sort of like it differs from subject to subject and theme to theme, depending on what I'm trying to depict, what kind of subject I'm portraying. I let that decide what kind of palette I'm gonna go with. So
yeah, that makes sense. Also, like just talking about the stylistic parts of your work, you also have a really interesting style of hatching. So you paint like little dashes that look like hair, like tiny pieces of hair. Is that inspired by like the comb cutting?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, because we talked
So,
about it earlier. Yeah.
When I was doing the pieces, I realized that these women, what they were doing was so basically the kind of style that they have is sgraffito technique, where they would carve something using the comb, right? So I wanted to like I found it very interesting. It was very interesting texture that it was creating, and so at the same time, like I said, I was doing a lot of research around Brahman, and then I met these women. So I wanted to find a fusion between the two. So what I realized was in Brahman there is this philosophy that we are all energy, like everything that surrounds us and even ourselves, we are all form of different energy. And I wanted to encapsulate that in some form of mark making. So these dashes that you see or these lines that you are seeing is my way to like represent these energy forms that I find around myself. So you would see like in a lot of my work, so for example, the monkey or the elephant or different subjects, you will see these lines around them, all around them. So it's like my way of saying that these are sort of like the energy that surrounds us. But at the same time, so quite interesting or quite bizarre or whatever you want to call it. So when I'm painting, right, so it happens quite often actually. So when I'm painting and I feel like my mind is getting distracted, I start to chant certain mantras or certain words in my head as a way for me to like come into my meditative state and to paint. So those lines that you see is me finishing one mantra. So I make one mark. That means I have done one cycle of it. For example, a basic example would be say Sam Sada Siv. So I would say that and I would make one mark. I would say this, I would make one mark. So that's just a way for me to like bring myself back into the work, because it happens more often than not that when you're working, your thought starts to get kind of like distracted, right? So in a way, those marks are also a representation of my meditative state, or yeah, I think that's the best way to put it, to be
Yeah, I
honest.
think it's
So
like
yeah, that's
the routine of chanting, and then
exactly,
that is
exactly,
forcing you to only think about.
exactly, and it again it relates back to George Batel's idea of the primitive mark making.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to invoke as well. Where see, for me, creativity is just mark making. Like no matter how detailed or how basic or how primitive it is. So those lines or those dashes are a reminder for myself as well that creating a form, creating a subject isn't just part of it, but also these basic lines and forms are also what is counts as a creative act. So
That's really beautiful. You talked about like a lot of your influences throughout, but I was just wondering, are there any like other like there any places that you typically draw inspiration from, artists that you continue to come back to except the ones you've mentioned, and like moments and experiences that you've noticed influence your creative process immediately, not just like themes or like child like your upbringing and more everyday things, I guess.
as like inspiration, I find in artists or
Both, like you can talk about artists and you can talk about just things that you've noticed inspire you just every day.
okay, that way. Uh, I like to read a lot, to be honest. Like, and it's not specific to art only. I love philosophy. So I kind of like I feel myself when I'm in that process, when I'm in between my paintings, I kind of see myself drawing or going back to a lot of like writers. I have like, for example, some of the examples would be say Nietzsche. I love Nietzsche a lot. Heidegger would be one another example. So I feel like that kind of influences me a lot to like start thinking in a way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a process. Like even though I'm not painting, what I like to do is I like to like keep sort of like those intellectual juices flowing, and something comes out of it. And yeah, I think writing, not writing, but yeah, but the reading would be a major part of that inspiration. So be it like even if it's around academic discourse, for example, if I'm reading say Nelson Goodman or Steve Baker, so these people are like they talk a lot about representation or like the idea of language.
Yeah.
And so when I'm doing that, I kind of at the back of my head I'm also thinking about okay, how could I like kind of incorporate that into my practice, right? And talking about artists, I kind of there are of course like I love old masters. I love Franz Marc, like I said.
Yeah.
At this moment, I find myself going back to Philip Guston a lot. Quite a
Philip
lot, actually.
Guston
Like,
so much.
I love Philip
His
Guston.
painting is beautiful.
Yeah, I know. I think this is the bizarre element of how he approached subject and themes, and I'm especially inspired by his entire journey, where he started as a figurative painter and then kind of like moved towards becoming more of a bit of a surrealist kind of abstract artist. But yeah, that's one of my primary inspiration there. And some other artists would be Bharti Kher, Charming Baker, Martin Whitford. Yeah, I think also both Gupta is one of the prime artists I kind of like go back to, especially because how rooted he is to his upbringing, and I kind of find that inspiration in my own experience as well. But yeah, I think that's I think everything inspires you in a way. Like it's about how you let the exterior factors influence you, and I feel like you have inspiration everywhere. Like be it like even if I'm like if I go for grocery shopping, I see something and that kind of like immediately clicks with me, and I come back and I do something about it. So yeah, I think personally like anything or everything could inspire you. So that's how I take it as. So.
That's nice. That's actually wonderful. Again, I love Philip Guston. I think like your red, like I think even I'm drawn to reds because of him, because of the way that he used pink so ardently, even though he was depicting such like such serious subject matter and like such serious themes. He was doing it with this like contrasting playfulness, and I think that's also quite visible in your work.
That's what, and I was privileged to go to his exhibition that happened in Tate Modern over here. That was an amazing show. Like I loved it. I think the fact, or what influences me quite a lot about him is the naivety of his subjects.
Yeah.
And how he depicted such serious things, like for example, Ku Klux Klan, he depicted those through such naive forms and such. I don't know. That's something that I kind of aspire to become in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah, he has basically he makes evil. Like I read this essay where they were talking about the banality of evil and how it's present in Philip Custon's work. So he'd come back to the motif of shoes, because in German concentration camps, you would take shoes from the Jews, because you needed leather. So they would just not have any shoes. So you just see pictures of mountains of shoes, and that's an image of trauma. So he comes back to those things and how evil manifests in those small ways. So I think that was really interesting. But that sounds lovely. Yeah. Just moving to, are there any other materials and techniques that you're interested in, you're experimenting with, and what are you working on right now?
Sculpting is something I've always found very interesting. I did kind of dabble into it through my masters and previously as well. I think the core of it is I love working with my hands, and be it I think you could say that I'm very romantic about the traditional way of painting, where I want to feel the canvas, I want to feel the colors and brush and materials. So I think sculpting is something I find very interesting, and I definitely would want to get into that in the future probably. But at this moment, I'm exploring. So lately, my fascination has moved from canvas to these wooden panels.
Yeah.
So I kind of find that very interesting how, say, the paint reacts to the wood. And that's my current exploration is focused on right now, where I'm trying to uncover all the possibility of how far I could take these mediums.
Yeah.
Because wood panels are not a very traditional medium right now. So I find that quite interesting. Plus also it kind of it would be a very interesting commentary on how we are degrading the nature by using wood as my material in a way, and depicting such subjects on that wood itself. So yeah, I think that's what my current exploration in terms of material is. So.
That sounds really interesting. Just one last question. What have you been paying attention to in contemporary art right now?
Sorry, could you come again?
Yeah. What have you just been paying attention to? What artists, what work, and what ideas have you been paying attention to in contemporary art right now? You mentioned performativism.
Performatism, yeah.
Performatism.
So there's this concept given by Raoul Isherman called double framing method. So if you are familiar with the work of Wes Anderson, or say Ian Martel, who wrote Life of Pi. So so basically double framing is a strategy where what they do is they try to coax you towards something with aesthetic, and once you are kind of trapped in that aesthetic frame, they give you that meaning. Wes Anderson does that very well, actually.
Yeah.
So I find that very interesting because that's kind of the strategy I employ as well. For example, if you look at my paintings from far, you would see that, oh, there's a monkey, there's a beautiful monkey there. But as you come close, you start to see these ambiguous forms around it, these hidden lines, which speaks of a deeper truth or a deeper meaning. So that's something that I'm observing a lot at this moment. It's happening all around the world right now.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that's going to stay, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's kind of the contemporary sort of ideas I recently encountered upon, and I feel like is currently being exercised by a lot of artists out there right now. So
yeah, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much.